Hi folks, welcome to this week's episode of the Ask the R podcast, where we've got a real treat for you. In this week, we're going to be deep diving into listeners' questions. These questions have come flooding into me from all over our social media channels. So sit tight, let's dive in, let's see if we can solve some problems for people. Hi folks, welcome back to the Ask the R podcast. Today we're going to be deep diving into listeners' questions because planning in the UK really is devilishly difficult. It's so difficult that some of the facts that we see, some of the questions that come to us are just utter madness. So we're going to start off with our first feature of the day, which is this one.
It's time for You Couldn't Plan It, the feature where me and my team have scoured the internet for stupid, silly and downright infuriating planning-related facts. Let's go.
So in this one here, I have found this on Yahoo News, and this one is really quite strange. So if you imagine in your mind's eye, I'll get Kian to put up a picture for those of you that are watching on YouTube. If you imagine these sort of small residential units, almost like retirement flats, in fact, they often have these little sort of chain link fence dividers. Well, this woman, a retired widow, they've become embroiled in a ridiculous planning dispute with a neighbour because what they've built is basically a great big planter. So it's a wooden planter that's got all sorts of little ornaments and flowers and plants in, and it divides between her property and her neighbours. And this woman, Jane Higgins, 74, she's had this planter installed in her front garden of this semi-detached house, and this is in East Lothian in Scotland. She spends her days out there tending it, looking after her flowers, giving them a little polish and all that kind of good stuff. And what's happened is one of the neighbours has basically reported her, and she's been told that she needs to go for retrospective planning permission for the structure as the neighbour had a issue with it. And apparently the main objection of this is that it overshadows their privacy because the owner of the planter is spending so much time out there looking after the plants. So ultimately, common sense shone through with all this, and this lady Jane was granted her planning consent, but only after her family spent hundreds on architects' fees and planning fees. So bit of a nuts one. You couldn't plan it. And let's jump back on into the episode. So what I've got here, I put a post out on a Facebook group, which is where lots of people go to get advice on live planning consents. And the group is unlike most Facebook groups, which are quite often populated by a whole load of Karens. This one is actually populated by quite a lot of experts. So I put a post out and I said, I'd really like some fresh questions for my podcast feature. Fire away, shove them to me. And we had a lot. So the first one I've got is David. And David says here, can the council put a TPO, that's tree preservation order, on a tree or trees where there is an extant existing planning consent already on the site, which would result in the loss of some of the trees and that these trees would need to be removed for the current application as well? Let me read that again. Can the council put a TPO on trees where there is an existing planning consent in place? This existing planning consent would result in the loss of some of the trees, and these trees would need to be removed for the current application as well. There's a couple of things that we need to look at here. So, essentially, David, yes, a local planning authority, they can put a tree preservation order on trees, even if there's a planning consent in place. But there's a few important nuances to this, and essentially we'll start with the positives. So tree preservation orders can be made at any point. Normally when a TPO, in fact, there's a video I've done completely on tree preservation orders. You should go and check that out. the tree has to fulfil the criteria. They can't just put a TPO on and slap a TPO on for no reason, and you do have the opportunity to object. But essentially, a tree preservation order can only really be put on a tree that has got significant amenity value, and generally speaking can be seen from public land. So if these trees were sort of in a front garden, or maybe the crowns were fairly significant. So councils do have the statutory power to make a TPO at any point, including after permission has granted. They tend to do this if they believe that trees are under immediate threat and they are of significant public value. So where I've seen this happen before is you may well have a planning permission in place and the site setup is going on and some trees start to get removed, and it may not have been clear that these trees were going to be removed to facilitate the construction. Tree preservation orders do not override extant consent if it is explicitly shown in the planning permission. So what do I mean by that? This works both ways. If you are showing trees for removal as part of a planning consent, then those trees can be removed to facilitate the development, even if they've got tree preservation orders on it. Normally it would get picked up at the planning stage and there'd be other things that you'd have to do. But that mechanism is designed, councils don't keep a register of the quality of the trees necessarily, so sometimes the only time they find out any information on trees that are protected by TPOs is when a tree survey is done to support a planning application. So if the permission clearly shows that those trees are going to be removed to facilitate development, and that links into our other question in a bit, and it's usually clearly shown in something called a tree protection plan and an arboricultural method statement, that part of the consent basically takes precedence, okay? So a TPO cannot override a lawful planning permission. The caveat is, if the removal of trees is not clearly shown or required by the permission, then the TPO can still apply. So you need to check your documents very carefully, David, and if those trees are shown for removal as part of the planning consent, then you're good to go. Material changes or new applications may be affected. So if, as the developer, you were to later submit a variation or amendment or a new application, then the TPO would become a material consideration and it could limit or block tree removal. Case law supports this. So courts have upheld previously that TPOs cannot override a lawful and implementable planning permission, but they do not apply to future or revised proposals. So tread carefully, get good arboricultural advice. The practical implications of this, I guess, is that if the tree removal is clearly authorised by the existing consent, then the TPO is likely not enforceable against those removals, and you can crack on, David. If it's not clearly authorised, if you haven't got a arboricultural method statement, a tree protection plan that clearly shows the trees that have now got TPOs on them being up for removal, then it could block or delay works, and there's going to be a lot of backwards and forwardsing on that. So before we get on to our next question, it's time for a new feature, and I've worked very, very hard on this jingle. Here you go, you're going to love this one.
It's time for Tremendous Facts. Oh yeah. Get ready to learn, and that's a fact. Tremendous Facts.
It's terrible, isn't it? And that's what we like on the RCR podcast, an absolutely terrible jingle. So while I frantically scrabble around in the background and try and find my PDF that has got all my tremendous facts on it, let me know in the comments what you thought of that jingle. You can thank AI for that. So there we go. Here we go. So I'll give you two. Trees communicate with each other using underground fungal networks, often called the wood wide web, and that is actually true. Mycorrhizal fungal networks in the soil help trees to communicate. If you've ever seen the film, is it Avatar? The blue creatures? It is, isn't it? Kian's nodding in the background. That's essentially what that whole program, that whole film is about. So there we go. They do communicate. So don't punch trees. I'll give you another one. A single mature tree can absorb up to 48 pounds. I don't know what 48 pounds is in... let me Google that. 48 pounds. Let's see. 48 pounds in kilos. 48 pounds in kilos. The production value of this podcast is outstanding, isn't it? That is 21 kilos. So, where are we? Let me go back here. A single mature tree can absorb up to 21 kilos of CO2 per year. That doesn't seem right. I'm not sure that's right. I think that figure should be higher than that. And I'll give you a bonus one. The oldest known tree is a 9,500-year-old spruce tree in Sweden, named, I'm going to regret this, Old Tijico. Well, I've no idea how you pronounce that one. So there we go. That's Tremendous Facts.
It's time for Tremendous Facts. Oh yeah. Get ready to learn, and that's a fact.
Yeah, that's enough of that, isn't it?
Tremendous Facts.
I'm sorry to subject you all to that. Right, okay. Let's have a look at our second question, if I can find it here in front of me. So the second question, this one is in from James on Facebook as well. And this one says, has anyone been successfully prosecuted purely for breaching an approved arboricultural method statement? Not the BS 5837 breach itself, but the actual approved details. They're very loaded, these questions, aren't they? That is a brilliant question, James. It cuts right into a legal grey area, which I suspect is exactly why you've asked it. The short answer is, from the research that I've done in the last 48 hours, there's no public record of anyone being prosecuted solely for breaching an arboricultural method statement. I could do this. I could do this live on the air, couldn't I? I could do this live on the air and find out internal comms, and I'll send my where are we? I'll send my principal arboricultural consultant a message. Hang on, here we go. Let's see if this works on air. Hi, Peter. You are live on the Ask the Arb podcast at the moment. I've got a question in from a listener, and I'm not sure of the answer. Basically, what this chap James is saying, and I'm going to play your answer later on. James is saying, has anyone ever been successfully prosecuted for purely breaching an approved AMS? Not the BS 5837 breach itself, but the actual approved details. I reckon that's a brilliant question, and I can't find there being any public record of anyone being prosecuted solely for breaching a AMS. When you send me your reply, bear in mind, I'm going to play it live on air.
Oh, that's a really good question. The honest answer is I don't know. My instinct is that no, there haven't been any prosecutions as such. When we've been involved with breaches, and we've been involved with a few of these now, the council, the local planning authority generally tend to work towards a pragmatic resolution to the problem, whatever that problem is. So when there's been damage to trees, we need to do whatever we can do to put that right if it can be rectified. If it can't be rectified, and we're looking at tree removal, then there'll probably be some replacement trees conditioned and that kind of thing. But as far as actual prosecutions go, I cannot think of any off the top of my head. I think the only instances where there would be an actual prosecution would be if there is also a breach of TPO or conservation area protection at the same time.
Right, we'll see. We'll see if he comes back before this episode's finished. So there's no public record as far as we can see, and Peter will confirm that. But, and this is a big but, once the AMS is submitted and approved as part of your planning conditions, it does become a legally binding part of the permission. So breaching it isn't just a slap on the wrist, it is a breach of a planning condition, which is what we say to our customers. We encourage them to contact us once they've got their decision notice. And the reason that we do that is because we want to have a look at it, and we want to make sure they're not going to do anything that breaches those planning conditions. Because if you breach the planning condition, then that can trigger very serious enforcement action. And that sort of enforcement action will basically be enforcement notices put up at the site. It might even be a stop notice. We've seen that happen. I'm actually going to take Kian out and record a YouTube short after we finish these podcasts, because there's a builder outside that's trenching through a whole load of routes at the moment. It can also lead to a refusal to discharge planning conditions as well. If that breach of planning conditions leads to damage to protected trees, which ties nicely into David's question earlier, especially those sort of under a TPO or in a conservation area or something like that, then in theory, criminal prosecution could follow. Not for breaching the AMS itself, but for what the breach caused. And I think that's an important subtle point. You can go away and search online and you can find loads of developers that have been prosecuted for what the breach caused, essentially. So whilst a breach of your arboricultural method statement or your AMS on its own isn't going to drag you into court, it can potentially set off a whole chain reaction that will land you in real trouble. So treat the AMS like gospel. It may not have teeth on its own, but it is usually wired into the planning system and tree protection laws. So breach it and you could lead to all sorts of legal repercussions on there. Peter hasn't replied yet because I've told him probably he's going live on air and he won't like that. So there we go. So that is the end of this week's episode. We only got through 2 questions. We'll go for some quick fire ones next week. So essentially, if you are a architect or a consultant and your projects keep hitting walls with the planning process, if you've got challenges, then maybe, just maybe, we can help. We've got lots of free resources. There's lots of free videos on YouTube that will help you. We've also got free resources on our main website. There's links to my books that you can see in the background, and hopefully that will help you out. So that's all for today, folks, and I'll see you in the next one.